Okay, just as an extension of what we had looked at in regards to using Anki as the free flashcard system that enables you to undertake retrieval practices, and we worked our way through that. I suppose the next thing we need to look at is providing you with a pathway in regards to what types of questions do you actually need to ask yourself. In other words, what sort of questions do I need to be putting into my flashcards and challenging myself in regards to the knowledge or the expected understanding of a particular subject area. And of course, in the end, what you're actually being guided by is three separate things. One is the learning outcomes for that particular subject. The second one is the lesson objectives. And then the third one is the content that's associated with the lesson objective. So, three elements that you need to consider. But then, whilst that is pertinent, in other words, while that drives how or what type of questions I'm going to be asking myself, getting down to the specifics is sometimes a bit of a different matter. That is, knowing exactly what types of questions I need to be asking myself in regards to all of those three elements, I think sometimes is often not as clear as ideally we would like it to be. So I'm just going to use the D-Hubs to the first lesson as the example, which is the introduction and the bone structure and function, as the way that I would suggest going about setting up your Anki system. The subject learning outcomes. Now, these are different than the lesson objectives. These list what all of the outcomes are for the whole of the 13 weeks of study. And so for D-Hubs 2, there are four. Identify basic structures and functions in the muscle and skeletal system, summarise the anatomical features and functions of the axial and appendicular skeleton, and so on. I'm not going to read through them all. But this is for the whole subject, right? So there were four learning outcomes for the whole subject. And so you're not going to find all of these located in the very first lecture, very understandably. But what you're likely to do is see the first one being addressed in the first lecture. So that then leads us to the actual lesson objectives, doesn't it? So if this is what the learning outcomes are, and if we're addressing the first learning outcome here, then what specific lesson objectives are going to be associated with this first learning outcome? Identify basic structures and functions of the muscle and skeletal system. And ideally, within the lesson, that particular lesson, it will have the learning objectives outlined. And so they do in this particular lesson for D-Hubs 2, bone structure and function. And so what I need to know by the end of this lesson are these 5-6 points. Understand key functions of the skeleton, know the basic building blocks of the skeleton, specifically bone matrix and cells, know the basic bone cell types and their function, know the different classifications of bone, list and label parts of the long bone, and introduce the importance of this in a clinical context. So what I'm getting at in a very long-winded way is that at the start of every single lesson, you should be really clear about what you need to know at the end of the lesson. That then should drive the questions that you ask yourself in regards to the content that you're about to address. For example, the very first one here is understand the key functions of the skeleton. And in one slide, it's listed there: support, protection, movement, blood cell production, and mineral storage. So it's done, right? So that very first learning objective for that lesson is covered literally in one slide. And so for me to be held accountable for that in a or that concept in an assessment of any type, then the type of question that I'm asking myself, I think, is fairly obvious. I would be asking myself, what are the 5 key functions of the skeletal system? And in my answer, for example, on my flashcard, I would have support, provides the body's framework and maintains posture; protection, protects vital organs from injury; movement, acts as levers for muscles to move the body; and so on. All right, so what we're doing here, the aim always is to translate your specific learning objectives for that lesson into retrievable practice questions like the Anki system provides you with. And so then we move on to the second one, don't we? We've ticked the first one off right away. The second one, know the basic building blocks of the skeleton, bone matrix, and cells. So it tells me here, what are the basic building blocks of the skeleton, specifically in regards to bone matrix and the cells that are involved in it. And so, basic building blocks of bone. The bone matrix, number 1, is made up of water, inorganic material, and organic material. So that could be a question, right? So the first question could be, what is the bone matrix made up of? My first question could be, it's made up of water, organic material, or inorganic material. And I might even want to put this diagram in my slide. Then the next slide gets into a bit more detail. In other words, it gives you more detail specifically about the organic material. So here, it's made up of organic material, water, and inorganic material. Well, specifically, what's the inorganic material? Well, it's hydroxyapatite crystals, which provide rigidity and hardness to bone. So therefore, I might have a question. So the first question might be, well, what is the bone matrix made up of? It's made up of water, organic material, and inorganic material. My next question might be, well, what is the inorganic material made up of? And what does that material provide to the bone? And so down here, the inorganic material is made up of hydroxyapatite crystals, which provide rigidity and hardness to bone. So that might be the next question that I have, for example, in my Anki system. And then the next question, and getting back to our learning objectives here, is the bone matrix. So we've been through that. We've looked at water, organic, and inorganic material. I apologise, I didn't look at the organic material, so that could be your next question. What is the organic material made up of? Various types of collagen, type 1 and type 3, and they provide tensile strength and flexibility. So your question might be, well, what is the organic material made up of in the bone matrix, and what does that contribute to bone? The answer would be, it's made up of type 1 and type 3 collagen fibres, which provides tensile strength and flexibility to bone. And then getting back again to the learning objective, the next one is, know the basic building blocks of the skeleton, the bone matrix. We've talked about that. Now, the cells. What are the cells? And so we scroll down here and we have a look at the cells. There are 3 different types of cells that are involved in bone development. 1 are osteocytes, 2 are osteoblasts, and 3 are osteoclasts. So there are 3, yeah? And so my first question might be in my Anki system, well, what are the 3 cell types? And then my next card might say, what do osteocytes do? And my next one might say, what do osteoblasts do? And my next one might be, what do osteoclasts do? Right? And so I'm asking myself consistently, what am I being asked to know? And how does that align with the lesson learning objectives? The next one here, know the basic cell types and their functions. So here I'm just nominating the cells. Here I'm being asked to explain their function, right? So I know what the three are. Now I'm being asked to explain their function, which we've addressed already. So then the next learning objective is know the different classifications of bones. So we go down and that should be addressed, right? Classification of bone occurs via 4 different methods, right? So that might be my first question that I ask myself on my Anki flashcard. Then I might ask myself to elaborate on that. What are they? Well, their shape, their structure, development, and location. And then I might go into further detail. What do we mean by shape? Well, what's an example? A long bone and a short bone. By structure, what do we mean? Compact or spongy bone, and so on. Yeah? Now, I've said here, we now focus on shape. As a result, then, what you're being told is that the key way in which you should understand bone structure is in regards to its shape. For example, long bone, short bone, fillet bone, irregular bone, sesamoid bone. So again, that might be another question. And you might ask yourself for examples of each of those. Yeah? Then we get back to the learning objective again. Know the classification. Learning objective. Know the classification of bone. I've done that. List and label the parts of long bones. So we go down and we should be able to find that. List and label the class. And there they are, right? So parts of long bone, the epiphysis. Parts of long bone, the epiphyseal plate. Parts of long bone, the metaphysis. Parts of long bone, the diaphysis. And so as a result then, I can begin to ask myself a series of questions in regards to those. And added to that, I need to be able to identify what the parts are. So I might have a card without this circled on it, right? Just this. And that card the question side of it might have this diagram on it without this being highlighted. And the question underneath might say, what is the name of the location at the end of bones? Or have this blacked out, right? So just circle this area in here, and I ask myself, where is the epiphysis? And then in the next slide, I have this one outlining the epiphysis. So what am I doing? I'm trying to orient you to the bigger picture in regards to what you're always going to be held accountable for in regards to the content. And that will always come back to the learning objective for the lesson. That will always, so you yourself should be clear about what they are. Then that guides you into what content is contained within the lesson that relates to the learning objective, which then guides you in regards to the sort of questions that you should be asking yourself in regards to retrieval practices. For example, the use of the Anki card system. All right, I'll leave it there.